Someday Angeline by Louis Sachar, 21. Pretty feet and her green eyes. Gary squeezed Mr. Bone's hand. He waited for Angeline's father to say more, only he didn't think he wanted to hear it. Abel's face was now streaked with tears. "Hospital," he whispered. "Let's go," said Melissa, still holding Gary's hand. "I'll drive." They rode the elevator down to the street and climbed into her car. She and Abel got in the front, and Gary and Gus sat in the back. And on the very rear of the car was a bumper sticker which said, "Save the Whales." "She fell off Mitchell Pier," Abel uttered. He stared out the window at a billboard advertising chewing gum, as if he were suddenly very interested in which brand packed the most punch. Gary was glad he got to go along. He thought that if anybody had stopped to think about it, they wouldn't have brought him. Kids never get to go along on emergencies. They would have sent him home instead. He felt terrible for feeling glad about this. He didn't think he should be feeling glad about anything. And this suddenly occurred to him, when Angeline might be dead. He tried to think about something else, or better yet, not to think at all. He wondered why he was thinking so much. His brain was going a mile a minute. He didn't think he usually thought so much. He wondered if Mr. Bone and Gus were thinking as much as he was, or if he was the only one because he was a goon. He didn't wonder about what Angeline's father was thinking. He didn't want to think about that. When they got to the hospital, they were directed to a waiting room where they were told to wait. There was somebody else already in the room, but he looked more like a patient than a visitor. He was dressed in a hospital gown and robe. Gary wondered who he was. Suddenly, he thought of a joke. "If we have to wait, does that mean we are waiters, like we have to serve food?" Then he felt awful for having thought of it. How could I make up jokes now, he wondered. "Gary," said Mr. Bone. She held out a tissue to him. He took the tissue from her. He hadn't realized he'd been crying. Angeline would have thought it was a funny joke, he thought. The man in the hospital gown shivered. A doctor finally walked in. "Are you Angeline's parents?" he asked. "I'm her father," said Abel. The doctor took a deep breath. "Angeline was underwater a long time, I'm afraid," he said, "before Mr. He gestured toward the man wearing the hospital gown and robe. He pointed again at the man. The man shivered. "Cool Breezer," he said in a high, raspy voice. "Before Mr. Cool Breezer was able to pull her out," said the doctor. Everyone turned and looked at Cool Breezer. Cool Breezer looked away. When she arrived, her lungs were almost completely filled with salt water, the doctor said. "We've done all we can do. Now it's up to her." Melissa put her arm around Abel. "She'll make it," she said. "I know she will." "Angeline's tough," said Gus. "I'll take you to see her now," said the doctor. "But before I do, I want to prepare you. She won't be able to see or hear you. I think the earliest we can expect any kind of positive reaction from her won't be for at least another 24 hours. "Then will she—" Abel started to ask. "Her brain went a long time without oxygen," said the doctor. "You just never know." He led them down a long corridor, through several sets of double doors. "You never know," Abel repeated. He led them into Angeline's room, then left. Angeline lay on top of a bed, not under the covers. She was wearing a hospital gown, like the one Cool Breezer was wearing. There were bottles hanging above her, and there were tubes coming out of the bottles and sticking into her arms and neck. A nurse was stationed alongside her. The nurse stood up and moved out of the way as Abel approached. Abel silently stared at his daughter. "Mitchell Beach," he said after a while. He looked around the room. "What was she doing at Mitchell Beach?" Cool Breezer shrugged. "Nina," muttered Abel. "Her mother drowned at Mitchell Beach. I haven't been back there since." He looked back at Angeline. "What were you doing there, Angel Face?" he asked. He didn't know why he had just called her that. He'd never called her Angel Face before. Nina used to call her that. Gary thought he understood sort of why Angeline went to the beach, but he couldn't explain it. "Mr. Bone, may I have another tissue, please?" he asked. She gave him one. "Cool Breezer," said Gus. "What?" Cool Breezer violently shivered, interrupting him. May I have a tissue, Mr. Bone?" He didn't seem to think that she had a strange name. She gave him a tissue and he blew his nose. Then he told them what had happened. "I was fishing off Mitchell Pier," he said in his scratchy voice. Angeline walked up to me and we talked and—" "What'd she say?" Abel asked. "Do you remember what she said?" Cool Breezer thought a moment. She said you drove a garbage truck. Cool Breezer had rebaited his hook after he caught the boot. He dropped the line back in the water, sat down, and opened a new can of beer. He hummed to himself and looked around for Cool Feet. He stood up. He didn't see her. He threw his beer down and ran to the end of the pier. He looked over the rail and saw her being washed underneath it. The next thing he knew, he was underwater. He hadn't taken off his shoes until after he was in the water. He swam after her and managed to grab her by the shirt. He wrapped his arm around her waist and struggled to get her back to shore. The tide was pulling them out while the waves kept knocking them forward. He tried his best to hold her above the water as he kept being swept under. At last he was able to feel the ground with his tiptoes, but he was unable to make any progress until a giant wave crashed directly on top of them. They tumbled in with the white water. He carried her onto the sand. Her face was covered with sand and her mouth was filled with salt water. He tried giving her mouth-to-mouth resuscitation, but she didn't respond, so he picked her up and ran her wet socks across the beach to the liquor store on the other side of the street. "Howdy, Cool Breezer," said the man behind the counter. "You look like you need some brew. Who's your little friend?" "Call an ambulance," Cool Breezer said, and collapsed on the floor. "I'm sorry," he said when he finished telling them what had happened. "You have nothing to be sorry for," said Melissa. "You saved her life. You're a hero." He had always wanted to be a hero. He thought about what he had done, and he realized it did sound like something a hero would do. Still, as he looked at Angeline lying there, he didn't feel like a hero. "I'm sorry," he repeated. He looked at her feet sticking out from under her hospital gown. They were still the prettiest feet he'd ever seen. "Cool feet," he said sadly. Abel bent over and kissed Angeline on the cheek. "Someday, Angeline," he whispered. Melissa held Abel's hand. "She was all I ever lived for," Abel told her. "All I ever cared about. I was always so afraid I'd blow it for her." "Well, Abel," he said, "you finally did it." "No!" cried Melissa. "It wasn't your fault. You mustn't believe that." Gus and Gary walked up to Angeline. Gus kissed her on the cheek. "Angelini," he said. He, too, was crying. Gary also kissed her. He wanted to rip all the tubes out of her. It seemed to him that the tubes were sucking the life out of her instead of giving it to her. "I heard a new joke," he whispered. "Want to hear my joke, Angeline? Why doesn't an elephant need a suitcase?" "Why?" Angeline whispered. Gary's mouth dropped open. He couldn't speak. All he could do was point loudly. "I give up. Why?" Angeline asked again. Why wouldn't he answer her? He just stood there, looking like a goon. She looked around the room and tried to figure out where she was, but it was too crazy to figure out. Nothing made any sense. Why was Cool Breezer jumping up and down and whooping and shrieking, she wondered, and why was he dressed so funny? What happened to his wool cap? Why did he just kiss her foot? And now the other one. "Stop that!" she laughed. "What's going on here?" And who was the lady dressed in white coming toward her and shouting, "Doctor! Doctor!" "Why doesn't an elephant need a suitcase?" she asked. Why wouldn't anybody answer her? The lady in white shrugged. "Because it never takes a trip? It doesn't have any clothes? Doctor!" "That's not even funny," she thought. "That's not a joke!" she shouted. Why was everybody laughing? It wasn't even funny. She saw her father and Gus and Mr. Bone. Were they laughing or crying? She was getting very angry. "What's going on here?" she demanded. But the madder she got, the more she yelled. The crazier everyone acted. What were the tubes sticking in her? Why was Gus carrying Gary around on his shoulders? "Are you all crazy?" she screamed. Wouldn't someone tell her what was happening? "Cool Breezer," she pleaded, but all he did was yell and scream, and Gary was unable to talk. "Doctor!" the lady in white shouted. Why did she want a doctor? She looked too happy to be sick. And why, and this was what really didn't make any sense at all, were her father and Mr. Bone kissing? And that's the end of chapter 21.